welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Shel Carlson, Head of AI Strategy at Domino, but much more important, we are joined by Ivan Black, who is Director at FINRA for a good many years, 13, 14 years, and in charge of their machine learning AI and advanced analytics platform there, which is responsible for servicing hundreds of data science users and utterly ridiculous amounts of data. So we have this incredible opportunity to go in and find out how do they leverage this, how do they empower folks with it. So Ivan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always struck me back years and years ago when I did real work and actually had a data science team, it's always felt to me like I always wished there was someone like you as a counterpart. It was like, I could never get, my team and myself could never get access to the data that we wanted. We couldn't get access to the tools. We couldn't get access to the infrastructure. We had to try and figure this out and cobble this together with chewing gum and sticky tape. It wasn't scalable and all the rest of it. But it sounds like you've solved that and you've sort of made it your life, it sounds like your life's mission to go and create this at FINRA. Could you tell us a little bit about your role and what you've been building?
Sure. So to be clear, when you say 12 or 13 years, that's how long I've been working in this space at FINRA. I've been at for roughly 150 years. I lost track. It's been more than 20 years I've been at FINRA. And I've always been in the data analytics space for the most part, providing large-scale data analytics solutions to our data scientists and to our data analysts. 15 years ago, those were mostly SQL-based solutions, things like Presto. But obviously, in more recent times, in the last 5 or so years, 5 to 10 years, we've been doing more AI, more analytics, using Domino and other similar platforms like that.
Excellent. But could you give folks a rough sense of those orders of magnitude of the data? Because this is something that can be a little bit difficult for a lot of us to
so let me, if you guys will indulge me a little bit, and I appreciate all of you being here. I was concerned it was only going to be my mother and family in the back, but I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit. So historically, for those who aren't familiar with FINRA, we are a financial regulator. We work in the markets trying to ensure protect our investors and ensure that the markets are fair for everybody. That's fundamentally what we're doing. To that end, we bring in data from the markets on the equities and options side, in particular for NASDAQ, Amex, American exchanges that you're all familiar with. We bring in this data. So 10, 15 years ago, we were bringing in somewhere around 30, 40, 50 billion records a day. And we had 5 to 10 petabytes of data on disk. More recently, however, with the advent of algorithmic trading and the incredible increase that you see of volumes on the stock exchanges, we now average about 600 billion records a day. We have hundreds and hundreds of petabytes of data on disk. In fact, I think we're projected to exceed an exabyte of data on disk sometime this summer. So the data volumes are not quite AWS, Google, Facebook level volumes, but they're probably that next tier down. So we've had 10 to 15 years of experience sort of wrangling this data and trying to make it available to our users in a way that they can then leverage it to do the work that they want to be able to do.
I always feel like that's an apples to oranges comparison, though, because when you look at what most of their data is and the data volumes are, it's for unstructured data, and the actual structured data volumes aren't giant. Versus in your case, this is practically all structured data.
Yeah. So when I use that, when I quote those numbers, I am quoting probably 95% at least structured data, financial data for the most part. We do have a considerable amount of unstructured data. But because it's unstructured, I don't have quite as good of a sense of how much of that is we have, how much of that we actually have. So yes, so these volumes all the way up to the exabyte are primarily structured data.
Gotcha. Could you give folks a sense of how you make that available to folks and what folks use this data for?
So again, this data is coming into us from exchanges and firms. We bring that data in. It's all submitted daily. We have an ETL processes. We have data extractions, we have enrichment processes, and then we make that available in our data lake. So 10, 15 years ago, again, closer to 15 years ago, we were in-house, right? We had our own data centers, and we managed this all in-house. However, we realized we were never going to be able to scale long-term doing this in-house, and we made a strategic investment with AWS, and we've been working in AWS's cloud since then. So our data lake is S3 for the most part, but we also needed to build an entire ecosystem around that data, around the ingestion process, the ETL process, and then making the data available to our downstream applications and users. Needed an entire set of tools to make that data available to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I often hear folks talk about data silos, but it feels like, well, just getting access to the data is insufficient. You also need access to the tools and the infrastructure and everything else to be able to leverage that data. So it sounds like what you're referring to is this ecosystem that is providing the data, but also providing everything that's around it so that folks can use it and build things off of it.
Absolutely. So again, I keep saying 15 years ago, because that's really when we started working on this in earnest. We realized we needed, obviously, and everybody in here I'm sure is on the same journey, we realized we needed data management, right? We needed metadata to keep track of our data lake. So from my perspective at least, our data lake isn't the actual data sitting on disk. Our data lake is that metadata. Because without this metadata layer, we're not able to access this data, we're not able to find this data, we don't know what versions of this data we're looking at, it's totally unusable. So the metadata itself is as valuable as the data. Without it, we wouldn't be able to leverage any of that data. And I didn't mention it, but to give a sense for that ETL process, that enrichment process, every day we spin up somewhere between 150 and 250,000 nodes in AWS. We spin those up to take that 600 billion records of data and do the ETL and do the transformations and do the enrichment and then push it back out into our lake, register it with our data management system, and ensure that our users have access to it that very next day.
Could you give folks a sense of, well, so what do those users actually then build off of this? How does that data get used?
Now, I'm going to try to speak a little bit about FINRA's business. Bear in mind I'm a technologist, right? Not my area of expertise. But FINRA's business, at least one of our main lines of business, is this outsourced commitment we've made to the exchanges. They are required by the SEC to surveil themselves for all the bad sorts of things that can happen on an exchange, right? Insider trading, cherry picking, trade heads, all these sorts of things that can happen on a market. They've outsourced that to FINRA, and they basically rely on our infrastructure. The easiest way to think of it is a giant calculator. We bring all this data in every day, we run it through a giant calculator, and we look for anomalies. We look for any sorts of transactions or sets of transactions or individual stocks that raise a potential concern. And those are raised up, those are bumped up, and then they go into a human-based workflow to follow up on. Because while we have good technology, at the end of the day, the technology is not perfect. We can't make decisions based on what the technology is saying. We really need to follow up and dig into these things with human beings.
Well, that's, I think the story of everyone's life when it comes to unsupervised machine learning is that it requires more human supervision.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm curious about when they detect one of these things, when there is an investigation. What does that look like? I mean, it's usually difficult enough for those of us when we're looking to develop models and implement models, and we can work with long time horizon, shall we say. And often we're not terribly good at going in and documenting everything that we do and making sure that somebody else can follow up on what we're doing. It feels like it's the exact opposite when it comes to when FINRA would do an investigation or when your users are creating a project. Here, presumably very short time horizons, and documentation, governance is and reproducibility is presumably everything. Or is that not the case?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, most of our technology is built around this giant calculator, our batch processing, right, which is occurring every day. So when something comes out of that process and it goes into this human-based workflow, then we have human beings using things like Excel or using things like Domino, depending on the volume of data that's required to look at this particular problem. And if, I'll give you an example of, let's say something really is amiss, right? A lot of times we'll have something pops up, it turns out to not be an issue. But if something pops up and it turns out to be an issue, at that point, we need to put a case together to determine what's the right remediation here. right? And again, I'm not on the business, so I can't speak on this authoritatively, but ultimately, some of these cases will go to our enforcement team. Our enforcement team are the ones to determine what's any penalties that might occur or remediations that may need to occur to ensure that this particular issue is addressed. When something goes to enforcement, oftentimes they work with the broker-dealer, they work with the individual, they work with the firm, and it's taken care of. Sometimes things go to court. Sometimes there's a legal process involved. Again, I know less about that than the technology processes. But when something goes to court, we now need to be able to take the output, the analytic product that this enforcement action was based on, and trace it all the way back to the analysis that was done, trace it back to the code that was used, trace it back to the data that was used, the version of the data that was used, and ensure that we can show from a chain of custody perspective, all of this flowed in a linear progression to get to the ultimate analytic product. Because again, somebody's sitting in a court saying, yes, this is accurate. So it becomes very critical that we're able to trace everything back all the way.
Yeah, because I mean, we've been thinking for years about things like data management and data governance and data lineage, but it feels like it's only been in the last couple of years where we talked about model lineage and model governance. Is there a way in which the data governance and the data lifecycle should be expanded out to incorporate model lineage and the model lifecycle? Or is it best to treat these kind of similarly? Because I could imagine that our thinking around model governance would be pretty much biased towards what we're already doing on data governance. And that's either good because a lot of it's portable and transferable, or it's bad because actually the best practices when it comes to data management may not be the best practices when it comes to model governance.
Yeah, so I would say is pretty as of a picture as I'm trying to paint. We're still figuring this out too, right? We have not mastered this by any means. But you know, from a data governance versus a model governance perspective, I think your underlying concerns are the same, right? Again, you want to ensure that you have quality data, you have quality models, you want to understand the quality metrics, you want to understand the immutability, right? It's not quite the right word for a model, but you want to ensure that your data has not changed without you being aware of it, right? So for example, in our data lake, we never change data in our data lake. If we have an update to data for one reason or another, we make a new version of that data and we have both versions forever. So that if I want to know what the data looked like 6 months ago when I did a particular analysis, I can go back to that version of the data with that proper version of the code, et cetera, and so forth, and take it all the way through. So I think the concerns typically are the same. The implementation is clearly different, however.
Yeah, and I guess curious whether or not you've seen it work better in terms of taking the existing folks who are in charge of data governance and then asking them to go in and figure out what model governance should look like and what processes should be like there, or is it worked better to have the data science teams or the analytics users and others figure out what lineage looks like to them and what governance looks like to them and develop that? Is anything work better?
We've had a little of both, I would say. I'll start on the data side. On the data side, one of the big concerns, at least for us, again at FINRA, being in the financial services space and being a regulator in a financial services space, privacy and data security are paramount, right? That's like the absolute one thing we can never mess up. That has got to be perfect at all times. So one of the big data challenges inevitably is data access, data authorization, right? And historically, data authorization has been handled at a platform level. You have access to a particular set of data in this platform, or you have access to a particular set of data in that platform, or in this platform you may have a different set of data access. But that makes it very difficult at an enterprise level to say what access do people have to data. It makes it very difficult to audit what data that they've accessed, and it makes it very difficult to report in the aggregate what data are people using, what versions of data are people using, and how do we manage this better down the road. So we've spent the last couple of years basically trying to build an enterprise data layer within FINRA that we can apply to all of our analytical tools, including Domino. We worked quite a bit with Domino to ensure that this would integrate appropriately. And this data access layer allows us to have a centralized store for data authorization rules. It allows us to have a centralized store For data tagging, so for our petabytes and petabytes and petabytes of data, we can tag it and label it so that we have some idea what it is, what type of data it is. Not at particularly granular levels, right? But at least from a data classification level. Is this PII? Is this personally identifiable? Is this confidential? Is this internal use? At least at that level, at a bare minimum, where we have labels on this data. So now we've got the rule sets and the labels in a single system. Our tools like Domino integrate with it and allow us to say, okay, I as a user of Domino, here's my identity. Domino doesn't know what access to data I have. Domino can't give me access to any data unless the calls to this centralized data access layer say, yes, this Ivan Black has access to whatever the data might be.
Well, is there a side benefit of this then also enabling you to govern access to all of the other artifacts in the model lifecycle? So access to snapshots of the data that a data scientist might be using, or the analysis, visualizations, code, model versions as well?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing me to the other half of the question. On that half of the question, so FINRA is a technology company, right? We're a data technology, but fundamentally we end up being a technology company because trying to work at this scale, you have to have the technology that will work at that scale to allow your actual business people to do what they need to do. As a result, we have a very well-defined software development lifecycle, right? We've developed hundreds of applications and managed them over time, and it's worked fine. The approach we've taken to date, and I'm not going to say it's a perfect approach, but the approach we have taken to date is to take the people who understand that software development lifecycle and say, you know what, we don't want to use the software development lifecycle to manage models. We need a model development lifecycle. However, very much like on the data side, it's the same concepts. You have the same concepts between software development lifecycle and model development lifecycle. You need to make sure you have control access to the data. Make sure you have versioning of your code. Make sure you have your quality assurance processes are occurring. Make sure you have controlled access to pushing things out into production. Make sure you have your model monitoring built in from the beginning, particularly with models, having that 360-degree view of what's going on versus a linear view of what's going on. You don't want to start with model development and training, experimenting, and deployment and production, and monitoring is over here, and it never circles back to your development, right? You need the output from your monitoring to circle back into your development. So we've taken the approach of looking at the concepts behind our software development lifecycle and finding ways to automate them and to make them automatic. So our data scientists don't have to act like software engineers, right? They can act like data scientists. They can do what they want to do their development, do their experiments, do their training, and those artifacts can be generated automatically, and they can flow into the workflow, into the model ops workflow to allow us to govern this over time. So we can ensure the processes are being followed, and we can ensure we're getting the reproducibility, the lineage tracking, and all those sorts of things that we need in order to give us that reproducibility when something goes to court.
Yeah. I mean, I think I hear over and over again from organizations that want to build out those processes and want to formalize them, and generally finding it very difficult to find good resources around it. So we've got good resources when it comes to the software development lifecycle and on agile methodologies, but when it comes to the model development lifecycle, all of a sudden we're going back to crisp DM. Have you found anything which is good, which provides a guidance or a starting point for going in and codifying the model development lifecycle, or even better, how you organize the software development, you coordinate the software development lifecycle with the model development lifecycle?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about flexibility, right? Whenever we're talking about, honestly, technology, people, processes, it's all about flexibility, right? We need our technology to be as flexible as possible and integratable as possible to allow us to integrate it with the rest of our ecosystem. We need to bring people on board who they have expertise, they have skills already, but they're excited about new things, they're interested in learning, they're interested and excited about new opportunities so that they can then go off and learn the next new thing. Because as we all know, everything is changing very fast, right? If you look at Gen AI, 2 years ago, nobody really cared, and now all of a sudden, it's everything everybody wants, right? If I had hired somebody 2.5 years ago who had a particular expertise, but who wasn't interested in growing and wasn't interested in expanding their skill sets, they're not going to be as useful to us now that we have all these this Gen AI technology that we're investigating.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of the talent side of things, it sounds to me like you're in an extraordinarily difficult position of being able to manage that technology architecture because, if nothing else, all of this is growing so rapidly, the space is growing, but also because you have extraordinarily high requirements when it comes to the stack that you're building. I've always felt for most organizations what they really need is, for lack of a better term, an AI architect. Somebody who's think of as a traditional enterprise architect, but who understands the AI space and the AI stack. Obviously, that person being somebody who either doesn't exist or needs to be trained, or it's a people aren't coming out with that automatically, they have to grow into that. But in terms of folks who you need for your team, would it be somebody who's like an AI architect, or what are the kinds of folks that you look for and that help you in what you do?
I mean, for the most part, I'm looking for people, like I said, I'm looking for technologists who are excited to learn new things, right? That's the most critical indicator of success for me for a new employee, is that they're excited to learn new things. They need to integrate well with the team out of the box, right? We want people who have personalities that mesh well with everybody else. But at the end of the day, we're all learning. We're all technologists. We're all constantly learning new things. And you want somebody who's excited to learn new things, right? You don't want somebody who's looking to just sit there and turn a crank for the next 20 years and not do anything new. You're looking for people to help push the boundaries of what we understand now and what we could potentially be doing down the road. More often than not, we bring in people and they immediately start saying, wait, why are you guys doing it like this? Why aren't you doing it like this? I've seen this work better, right? And I'm like, great. That is exactly what I want out of you. Tell me where we can improve. Tell me where we're making mistakes now. We'll discuss it and say, does this new thing actually work for us? Or maybe it doesn't work in this context, but at least bring it up and give us the opportunity to explore it and to look to see if that's going to bring us better value.
This is a tough thing to ask, but do you find that there are certain people from particular backgrounds that are particularly good at this, or do you find that there's usefulness in classifying them in different roles, and that different backgrounds fit pretty nicely for different roles?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
So it's worked pretty well to keep them as generalists, keep it pretty broad, bring them in, and versus go in and pigeonhole yourself into that this is your ML engineer.
Yeah, when we bring somebody into my team at least, we want them to have experience with Domino, for example, right? We have Domino, that's our primary data science machine learning platform. We want them to have that experience. But what's nice about Domino is that Domino as a unique bit of software is actually quite small, right? There's not a lot to Domino's interface. It's not particularly complicated. The part of Domino that our users are constantly in are their workspaces. And those workspaces are using common open source frameworks. They're using Jupyter, they're using Jupyter Lab, they're using RStudio, they're using Ray, whatever it might be. And bringing in somebody who's new, because Domino providing these common frameworks for people to work in, it's not hard to find people who have that expertise, right? Domino as a platform is not complicated. It's nice if they have that experience, but the fact that Domino provides these common frameworks makes it that much easier to find people.
Industry analyst, I guess the thing that I liked about Domino was it always felt that it let data scientists be data scientists versus expecting them to also be DevOps professionals or developers or other things along the way. Wanted to ask you about all of that unstructured data, it's felt to me like the biggest opportunity with Gen AI is our ability to go in and use unstructured data, structure it, and go in and create new applications off of it. Any work that's happening there on the Gen AI side of things that you can share and talk about? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I can, like everybody, right, we're looking at Gen AI. It's very exciting. And because we do have a lot of unstructured data, there's a lot of interest in being able to leverage Gen AI to get into that unstructured data and to perhaps make it more structured, at least from a metadata perspective. Again, however, I'll say, being a financial regulator, that data privacy and protection is paramount. So with our vendors, for example, even with Domino, to be fair, who provide Gen AI capabilities out of the box, we're working with them very carefully and very thoroughly on the data protection side first before we enable these capabilities. That being said, we do have a number of projects going on, POCs and early days pilots going on to look to see how we can take Gen AI, LLMs, whatever they might, SLMs, I guess was what Nick was talking about, right? And providing those in front of our unstructured data such that we can get better access to it.
I mean, often the approach that I heard people try was to go, we're going to stand up an internal open source model and go that approach because of all of the data privacy and security challenges there. Is that approach you've gone?
Yeah,
or?
yeah. Everything we've done so far has been internal, but we've looked at both publicly available and open source models, the large language models. We've looked at smaller models. We've looked at training our own models. We have looked at fine-tuning models. We're sort of running the gamut right now as we try to find the approach that's going to make the most sense for us. Long term, I think we're going to end up with a mix of approaches, right? There's not going to be one ring to rule them all. But at the moment, it's sort of a all hands on deck. Let's figure out where we can get the most value out of this and ideally be able to put a stake in the ground on the horizon, right? We're not going to figure out the right answer quickly, right? We're going to give ourselves a direction to shoot for and say, that looks like it's got the highest value for us. Let's go that direction for a little while, and then we'll iteratively tack, right? Anybody sail? We'll tack on our way and adjust our course until we hit what actually ends up being the right place.
Presumably, it'll depend on the right model will depend on the use case and presumably time and development, given how quickly the space is evolving. Wanted to consider other challenges that you face. I would have to imagine that managing costs is like front and center, just because the data volumes are growing at such a pace. I don't know whether it's exponential or not, but I could imagine it very well being. How do you tackle the cost of infrastructure or cloud-hosted infrastructure, especially when it's growing that quickly?
We write big checks. Yeah.
Hey, you got to give us a better deal on it.
The cost's rough, but slightly more seriously. So, we've been using Domino now, I think 3 years or so. Originally, we basically had to roll our own cost solution, right? We basically combined data we could pull out of Domino with data we received from AWS, our cloud vendor, and provided that in a single view to our end users. Because while there is a single Domino platform team, there is not a single team responsible for Domino costs. That's borne out by the projects doing their work. So we needed to be able to tag the work that was happening in Domino with the appropriate project codes and map that back to the costs that we got out of AWS. So we made that available to our users a year and a half ago. That being said, Domino's recently come out with the FinOps piece of their product to allow for more granular financial and cost data. We worked with them, I don't know on how many meetings on that. I lost track. So I'm excited to use it. We actually have not implemented it yet, but it is something on our list to do. I would very much like to retire the custom solution and be able to leverage FinOps instead.
Excellent. But I mean, it sounds like as a general principle, if it might not be charged back directly, but at least have tracking out to your end users so that you can go in and explain those costs to folks. And so versus having this giant bill at the end of every month and not being able to break it down.
Yeah, and this is the model that we found has worked over the years. When we first got into AWS, one of the things people would tout is, going to the cloud will save you money, right? You're going to go to the cloud. You're not going to need to manage your own infrastructure. You're going to save money. In reality, we moved to the cloud and we started spending far more money on infrastructure, right? And that was because the users who had access to the infrastructure didn't have good approaches to managing it, right? All right, I'm going to start something up today. I'm going to start up a 20-node cluster on a Friday, and I'm going to go home for the weekend and not shut it down, right? That's sort of just inexperience in the cloud. And it took visibility and discussions with the organization at large over a period of a year or so to sort of train everybody on the proper hygiene, the way to manage compute in a cloud environment. Now on the data science side, our tent has expanded. Originally, we were just talking about software developers managing their own compute, right? But now with tools like Domino, we have data scientists, we have people in the business managing their own compute in some cases. They didn't go through that process when we migrated to AWS. They didn't get those lessons on how to manage compute in an efficient way. So we're having to have those same conversations with those organizations. It's part of the reason we produced this in-house solution early, was to provide them with visibility, because obviously they can't manage anything if they can't measure it. So we provided that early on for them to get visibility, to allow them to start to manage it on their own, and we found a reduction in costs as a result.
It feels like it's always back to people, process, and technology.
Always.
Like on the people side, training, understanding education around it. On the process side, going in and implementing processes around cost control and process standardization, and on the technology side, facilitating the actual tracking of all of this and making it easier for folks, presumably, to go in and do the right thing. So I've been hogging you with my questions for far too long. We should open this up to all of you. What are the questions that you guys have been sitting on patiently for? Well, I've been,
Michael. Thanks. So I'm interested in the, when you're talking about lineage within your models and what kind of grain you need to do there. Because what it sounded like was, for your regular data lineage, it's at the field level, right? You understand transformation and how data sets come together. Is it at that same level of granularity within the model, or is it model-to-model lineage or some combination?
So I don't want to pretend we have all the answers on this yet, right? This is still relatively new for us. We are trying to ensure at the moment that we have traceability at the model level. And when I say traceability, I mean for the code that created that model, the data, the version of the data that created that model, the version of the software environments, which I didn't speak on earlier, I probably should have. From a quick tangent, apologize. From a scalability perspective, one of the important things that we're getting from Domino is the ability for our end users to manage their own software environments. One of our early solutions prior to Domino, that was managed by a single team. Right, a single team of not enough people to scale to 300 data scientists. So back to your question though, the version of the data, the version of the code, the version of the software environment, the libraries and everything else, the training data sets, your ground truth for comparison, all of that data needs to be tracked from our perspective in order to say, yes, we can reproduce results that we are using over here at this point. But honestly, it's still fairly early days for us. We're still working towards that. We have a large number of people working on it. But I'm hoping, and we've been talking with Domino over the last probably 6 to 9 months about this, the capabilities that Nick was just demonstrating earlier today, I'm hoping we're going to be able to leverage those as part of what we've already developed to get to the level of granularity that we need.
So you were talking about accessibility earlier, like who gets access to what data sets. I imagine that at the scale you're working, it's a really complex rule set. So how do you go about managing that? Like who's involved, what are the processes, can you automate any of this?
Yeah, so what I'll say is that we have a lot of data, but it is a fairly deep data set. So it's not quite as broad as you might think, right? So we have essentially data owners for each different set of data, and it's not like a particular table, but a class of data. Those are the people responsible to ensure only the right people have access to their own data, or to a particular data set. So from a rule set perspective, we define the labels on that data adequately to let us write rules based on those labels. So if we have, let's say, a dozen labels, right, you only need rules around those dozen labels, right? So you might have 2 dozen or 3 dozen rules. So it actually ends up not being a Cartesian product sort of problem when you're looking at data access, because you're not giving people access to individual sets of data, you're giving them access to classifications of data. And that's how we're able to scale at that point.
Yeah, actually, you mentioned that most of the structured data, right? So if I heard correctly, you say you're after move to AWS, you store data in S3.
Yes.
Yeah, my impression is S3 more kind of unstructured data. I mean, for a structured data, how you manage the access?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so we do use S3 to store our data, even our structured data. It's just stored as files on S3. But again, we have that data management layer that we built years ago. And so the way our users interact with that data on S3 is they actually make a call to that data management layer. And they say, I'm interested in, let's just say, order data for, from this particular sets of dates, maybe for these particular sets of securities, and this particular version of this data, maybe the tip. I want the latest version. And then the data management layer answers back to, in our case, generally Spark, because the data sets are so large that people are generally using Spark clusters, although we've also moved to using Ray clusters or get their performance out of GPUs. But it sends back the references to the Spark children nodes that can then go out and in parallel talk to the data on S3. So it ends up working kind of like a database, right, where you're making a call to a central schema provider, essentially, but it's an independent of S3 itself. It's something we built.
So your metadata stored also the structured or unstructured?
Sorry?
Your metadata stored as a structured or unstructured?
The metadata is structured. The metadata is all structured. So we have business definitions, which is unstructured, but then we also have schemas, which are structured. We have attributes about who's allowed to access the data. We have version information in there. We have lineage information. So as we create new data sets and put them in the data lake, those new data sets are registered with our metadata layer and indicate this data was derived from X, Y, and Z. So all of that is all part of that metadata layer.
So that's a structured metadata stored in database, right? Or
It is a custom application, actually. That was something we built 15 years ago when we decided to move to AWS. We looked at off-the-shelf products for that 15 years ago, and they were all inadequate to task. So we built our own. If we were doing this fresh, there are probably products out there that could do it, I would say. I haven't looked at that space in years, so I'm not sure. But I would be surprised if there were not products out there that could do this, that couldn't do this for you now.
Talk about metadata, and you mentioned data classification, PI, SPI, and all of that, right? Is that metadata collection automated to any extent, whether it is attributes, business terms, versus even your classification? And are you also exploring AI, or have you already implemented AI-based solutions for
So
metadata classification?
you're going to make me talk about the other half of my house. So for the most part, that process has been manual to date because it's the first time we've gone through it, right? We need to determine the rules that we can use to automatically classify data. In some cases, it's fairly straightforward. If the data came from this particular provider, then it needs to be classified this way because we have contractual arrangements. That makes it easy to classify. In some cases, it's not quite so straightforward. So to date, I believe that's been a manual process. However, and this is the other half of the house, we've looked at a number of products that might be able to label and classify data automatically using LLMs, by fine-tuning LLMs effectively. And we're looking at that both less for the structured data, but more for the unstructured data. Because again, on the structured data side, we sort of have a handle on it, but on the unstructured side, it's not quite greenfield, but it's definitely newish. So we're looking at solutions for that.
And do you have an interface where people go in and type in data, or is it Excel that's getting uploaded? Because I face similar problems, right? And we've found ways around it, but it's still lacking that automation, if you will. So I'm trying to figure out how you guys do it.
Yeah, the vast majority of our data comes in from third parties using systems that we provide them to upload data to us. And again, at the scale we're talking about terabytes of data from individual firms is small still, right? You're talking about tens or hundreds of terabytes of data in some cases from some of the larger firms. So that's all automated. There are still some challenges to overcome, right? Sometimes there are smaller data sets that need to make their way into that data lake, right? That's a little bit more difficult. One of the important things, rules that we have, is that our data lake isn't touched by humans. right? Human beings don't interact with that data lake because we need to know that that data is correct, that it has not been changed, that nobody's ever manipulated it, right? That goes back to that lineage conversation we had earlier. So human beings don't interact with the data lake directly, but to your point, there are some cases where human beings have data sets that have made their way to them versus made their way through this system. That's still something we're trying to figure out a good way to work through. We don't have that use case very often, to be fair. We used to. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we still had that. It's much, much less common now for us. Yes?
Sorry, can you just walk us through an example of a kind of red flag that might crop up in the surveillance that you do, and then
All right.
how an LLM would like help you investigate?
All right. Those are two different questions. Because the example I would give you is, what's it called? Again, not a business person. Account churn would be the example I would give you because it's one I understand. That one probably does not lend itself to an LLM though. But I'll give that example first and then talk about maybe where LLMs might be able to help us. So account churning is this concept of, all right, I'm a uninformed investor. I have a broker dealer who's managing my account for me or holds my accounts for me. And they come back to me and they say, hey, you have a bunch of holdings in this particular mutual fund. I think you should move to this other mutual fund. You'll get a better return. And I say, okay, great, thank you. And they move it. And then 6 months later, they're like, oh, I found another mutual fund that's even better for you. And they move me to that one. And I say, okay, great, thank you. And they keep doing that. Well, it's potentially, if it really is a problem, they're not doing that to help me. They're doing that for commissions, right? Every time they buy and sell, they're earning a commission. And you can look at the volume of buys and sells for a given account, given the size of the account, and say, this is a $10,000 account, and they've bought and sold $100,000 worth of securities in the last year. That looks like they're churning this account for commissions. So that's an example of a type of red flag that might come up. Where LLMs might be able to help us is, like I said, a little bit more on the unstructured side, where we have prospectuses, right? And we need to be able to summarize these prospectuses and compare them to their advertisements, right? So their advertisement says, hey, you're going to get a guaranteed 30% return. Now, nobody does this, of course, but you're going to get a guaranteed 30% return, and you look at the perspective, and it's like, oh, maybe you get a 5% return. Or they say, the administrative fees are very low in this vehicle, and then you actually look at the perspective, and it says it's 10% fees, which is quite high. So that's a space where LLM will help sort of accelerate our ability to work through that data, because right now human beings have to look at those prospectuses, and they have to look for these clauses, and they have to look for these areas where maybe there's a disconnect between what's being said and what's actually being offered. And again, not a business person, but that's my best understanding.
So